This semester has been COVID round 2, but feels in a lot of ways like round 10. I'm pretty indoorsy and probably about as comfortable as being alone as one can be, but even I am looking forward to being able to get out more. That said, the time spent inside wasn't completely wasted, and looking back on this semester, I'm happy to say that I'm proud of what I was able to produce. I'll be going over with you guys my journey through my second COVID semester. I'll go over each of my game publications this semester, giving a brief overview of the product, how and why it got made the way it did, how it influenced my other work this semester, or how it changed my views on other work from this semester and beyond. At the very beginning of January, I joined a game jam where I produced Weirland. When I first concepted the game, I really wanted to delve into, pun intended, more formal attempts at utilizing procedural generation within games. That entire week I didn't really sleep all that much, and despite some pretty substantial exhaustion, I somehow managed to finish in time with this, Weirland. Especially at the time of creation, it was easily my favorite thing that I ever produced. The environments it created and the dungeons that spawned because of it built a great ambiance that encapsulated me for quite a while, to the point where I continued to work on it even after the jam, further attempting to refine the procedural generation of the dungeon to include more vertical elements, and responding to the criticisms of the game including the difficulty of combat and the awkwardness of the camera and controls. Weirland, while far from being a viable independent game, definitely marked an important milestone for me in game development. In that way, when I'm building my timeline for my portfolio beyond just this semester, I've quickly began seeing my portfolio as either my pre-Weirland projects and my post-Weirland ones. That might be a bit weird for people looking in, and may lend the question on what makes this game so special, as it's not really all that good, even in comparison to the other games that I produced. Ultimately, I think this mentality is formed as I realized and come to terms with the many strengths and weaknesses of my development process that enabled me to better target what and how I express my design techniques in the games that I have produced. That said, my affinity for this game's success, in my eyes, definitely gave me tunnel vision, and played a huge, sometimes even childishly obvious, influence in a lot of the other stuff that I produced this semester, where I think I only recently finally managed to move a bit further past that in the end of the semester now. Coming about a month off the heels of the creation of Weirland, Trials of the Moth was another game jam made over the course of a hellish weekend. In concept, Trials of the Moth was going to be my attempt to further build off of those core concepts in Weirland and really improve upon it. However, on the afternoon of the second day of the jam, I'd realized I made a load of mistakes on this piece. The main character of Weirland really never was the player, or the character, but rather the mysterious dark dungeon that the game explored, and so Trials of the Moth inherited all of the flawed gameplay from Weirland, but in an attempt to craft an open-world terrain in a matter of 2 days, failed to produce an engaging world. In some ways, Trials of the Moth felt more like me taking a handful of steps back from what I just produced earlier, which was certainly discouraging. Luckily, those steps back also gave me a chance to look at some of the bigger picture issues with my previous designs and start fresh to an extent, ultimately encouraging me to try to play with a far vaster array of styles and mechanical concepts than I otherwise would have. Between the creation of a number of my Jam games, I found myself ahead of my web projects I produce at work. My team had long discussed slipping a handful of Easter eggs into the College of Arts and Sciences websites, so when we got approval from our boss to do the whole text-based adventure game, I was ecstatic and got to work on it right away. Admittedly, this wasn't really the most planned out experience in the world, with most of the design concepts being largely either rudimentary or used as a way to poke fun at some of the other fantasy game genres. However, it was a great chance to work with an entirely different code base than my more traditional Unity projects. Ultimately, it inspired me to actually try using other JavaScript frameworks in later projects, inspiring Second Darkest Dungeon, a game I'm producing right now using React.js. For those of you who aren't super familiar, React.js is a front-end JavaScript library that operates more like a lightweight framework for web development. It is, by usage, I believe currently the most popular JavaScript web development framework, thus my motivation for learning to use it. So after that brief break from having produced Jam-style games, I started working on Bloodkin as my first game in my 8 games in 8 weeks challenge. Bloodkin is likely a game that's changed the most from the point of its initial conception to the finishing of its creation. It's actually indirectly and accidentally leading to me playing around with some more of the styles I frequently used with my later Jam-style games. Originally, the game was meant to take place in a hellish dungeon-like prison. However, due to time constraints, I had to make a determination on whether to pursue that line of artistic style and reasoning, which would certainly be extremely time-consuming to be able to execute, or to be able to add in a few extra abilities and levels. I ended up taking the second option and kept the level layout to contrast the player models, feeling significantly more ambiguous and geometric. While perhaps not being super close to what I originally conceived because of that, I ended up finding the contrast between the characters and the level actually to be fairly enjoyable and add to the experience of the game rather than detract from it. Admittedly, Bloodkin needs a bit more work in terms of levels and playability, and has a lack of finalizing polish, probably due to the fact that I finished it around 3 a.m. at the end of an exhausting 2-day sprint, but does a far better job at leaning into the gimmick of the game design, in this case, the timer switching between your different forms, the demon form and the spirit form, than my previous games were capable of doing. Number 2 from my 8 games in 8 weeks challenge, Do No Harm, was in a lot of ways an anomaly from the games that I regularly produced. It kind of dropped the fantasy action ambience entirely in exchange for a much more playful effect. This dramatic shift in tone actually really worried me at the beginning of the project, but ultimately turned out to be unfounded, as Do No Harm became my most popular game and one of my most popularly reviewed games that I'd ever published, actually even performing better than Wyrland in my metrics. Perhaps a bit funny, since the entire concept was actually probably indirectly pushed from a comment from one of my friends, noting that all of my games seem to veer towards the fantasy genre. The mechanical and narrative shifts were further reinforced by my use of different texture packs and assets, but mostly some of the quality of this game may very well be founded by the fact that this is the first game I ever produced that I wasn't doing it up until one terrifying sprint at the end of the day. In fact, I finished it at about 3 p.m. and managed to take the entire afternoon off. It was brilliant. Year 3 for the 8 Games in 8 Weeks challenge, Level Down reframed some of the casual tones that were felt in Do No Harm, but this time leaned specifically instead into the color palette for that feeling rather than the actual mechanics themselves. Level Down is the most recent work that I published through my personal pipeline, and especially given that it was only given a handful of days that were devoted to the creation of this game, you can really feel that it benefits the most from the mistakes that were made in the previous development periods. Here, I realized that the development cycle for almost all of my games came with the creation of a small handful of modular abilities, followed by the expansion and use of those abilities and a handful of settings, and from its conception, Level Down was meant to play around with that concept of production, which is where the lose one concept came in. If these modular abilities are crucial, causing the player to choose to lose one of those provides a meta level to the gameplay that allows for many more interactions through subtractive options of gameplay. The game, for its benefits, is still clearly under-polished, and while passable as a game jam, certainly needs a bit more development to truly come into its own, but still a great product in the end. Beatbound, unlike the previous projects listed here, was fundamentally an academic piece of work between myself and other students in Sir John's 460 class in general. Originally, the idea was conceived as a more conceptual art piece, framing itself as a means of reframing the way we thought of sound, tying it to position rather than time. However, upon discussion of what to do further and a few sessions of redesign, the final concept prior to the start of development was almost an exact mimic of what we were able to produce. Admittedly, I am a touch disappointed by the change in design direction, as while Beatbound is interesting enough to play around with, I think it loses a bit of the artistic value as an application. My own personal gripes, however, aside, this is another great chance to work outside of my normal comfort zone, given the project made extensive use of external code bases, which I don't frequently work with in my personal projects. Unfortunately, this ended up being finicky at best and buggy at worst. However, after combining the geolocation features of Google and Mapbox XDKs, I managed to bootstrap a working systems. Remaining design work and artistic choices were largely made at group consensus, with UI concepts, audio engineering, and further conceptualization all going through group before decisions were made. Especially given the nature of COVID, the development of Beatbound was occasionally quite rocky, since getting formal decisions that were required for development could sometimes be put off for a whole week before that work could be produced because of class. Despite all that, the development of the app was finished, and live pushed APK is available on itch.io. Throughout the semester, I've been working on producing a game overviewing the Darien region along with a number of groupmates in Kristen's 480 class. This game is yet to be completed, but luckily all of the software development for the game is done, leaving only some of the content creation and the content implementation to be finalized. Lots of the emphasis throughout this entire project has been looking at how gameplay mechanics reflect on the region being displayed, and has been a great look at the humanitarian implications of games as well as the actual design implications. Second Darkest Dungeon is the React.js game I mentioned earlier. It's still in development at the time of presentation, but the game is a text-based survival mystery game that intends to use minimalistic UI to engage with the user and provide an entirely self-tutorialed experience as well as a strong in-game ambience. Second Darkest Dungeon is being produced along with two of my peers in Annie's 380 UI UX class. Finally, one last in-production piece from Sir John's 460 class. I joined Attention Retention a bit later on in the development cycle, after I passed Beatbound to be built and completed since I didn't have the available required build software to convert it to an APK. However, I created the current working level for Attention Retention, as well as either producing or finding, then implementing, a number of animations to each of the given distractions made within the game, with the express goal of producing lots of motions and making them as flashy as possible to distract the player. And that is a brief summary of a majority of the game projects I've worked on this semester. Whew. It honestly has been a lot, but I'm proud of what I've produced looking back on it. Previously, my time as an undergraduate student in the English department, I regret not having put more time into the pieces I submitted for a number of creative workshops, and looking back on it, I don't feel like there was ever a time I really produced something truly unique or as engaging as I could have, and was constantly punching below my capabilities. That largely influenced a lot of what I've been working towards until now. Unfortunately, unlike writing a story, creating a game that is at the peak of what one can do takes much more specialized skills built up over a long period of time. However, I finally feel like I have built up enough experience and gotten comfortable enough with my game development pipeline that I can now finally focus on producing a few small but very high quality works to finish off my final semester. So, yeah. Thanks for your time. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm sure I'd be more than happy to clarify anything or provide any answers. Peace and much love.